Hello everybody, Shabbat Shalom. I am disappointed that we can't have services tonight, but instead what I wanted to do was make a video so that people could have some experience of Shabbat from inside their homes as opposed to going outside in weather that is negative 25 degrees. So this week's portion is Parashat Bo. And last week, for Ethan's Mincha Bar Mitzvah, he read a selection from Parashat Bo. And we read it this week on Saturday morning. And I wanted to offer a few words of Torah about Parashat Bo. So the resource that I used in thinking about this week's Parsha is from a book that I bought from one of my favorite teachers, Rabbi Arthur Green. And it's a book called Speaking Torah. And one of the most interesting plagues in the Exodus story is darkness. It's a little bit different. Boils, locusts, frogs, you can sort of understand why they're so terrible. Darkness, on the other hand, sometimes darkness can be really terrible and frightening, and sometimes darkness can be wonderful. For example, when you want to be sleeping, darkness can be great. But this darkness wasn't just your everyday kind of darkness. This was a darkness that the Torah tells us. It was a darkness so thick it could be felt. And this is a very interesting detail, and I'm not exactly sure what it means or what the Torah intended for it to mean. What does it mean that a visual phenomenon like darkness is so thick that it can be felt? And this is the type of detail in a Torah portion that the Hasidim would love to drash, they would love to explicate, they would love to talk about. Because anytime there is a ambiguity in the Torah text that is pregnant with the possibility of interpretation, the Hasidim just really take hold of it and use it as an opportunity to impart some sort of deep spiritual meaning in a detail in the Torah that if you weren't reading it closely or inquisitively, you could just sort of skip over. So in Rabbi Green's book, he first quotes the verse from the Torah itself. Moses raised his hand toward heaven, and there was a great darkness in all the land of Egypt. People did not see their brothers, and no person could rise from where he was seated. So here we have an example where you have a darkness so thick that people couldn't see their fellows, and they couldn't rise from where they were seated. They couldn't rise from where they were seated. So what is this kind of darkness? Here's what the Or HaMeir writes about this verse. This is the great darkness in all the land of Egypt. Where awareness is lacking, there is great darkness. Where awareness is lacking, there is great darkness. You then fall into the narrow places. Mitzrayim, Metzaryam. So this is a play on words that is very famous in the Jewish tradition. Mitzrayim is the word for Egypt, but it also has within it the Hebrew word tsar, which means narrow. So Egypt is not just a physical place, it's a spiritual place. It is the narrow places in our spiritual lives. But Scripture then tells us what this darkness is. People did not see their brothers. See means that they didn't consider them. They didn't take to heart how much they could learn from the goodness of the people around them. On the contrary, they kept finding fault and lack in others, glorifying their own deeds. This led them to walk about in darkness and to see no light. People like that cannot progress from one rung to the next. No person could rise from where he was seated. They stood about rather than walking forward, as a Jew is always supposed to do. So I thought that this was really brilliant and really inspirational. Here we're not talking necessarily about how much physical light was available in Mitzrayim, in Egypt, in the narrow places, but rather how much luminosity was in the space. How much were people willing to learn and willing to see deeply in the people around them? When we spend our spiritual energy, when our mind's eye is directed towards glorifying our own deeds and justifying our own opinions, instead of listening and truly seeing the other and figuring out what we can learn from that person, we are in darkness. We cannot progress in our lives. We live in a state of spiritual and intellectual paralysis. That is darkness. That is a darkness so thick it can be felt. That is the alienation that we feel. That is the suspension that we feel when we are unwilling to engage with the people around us, with our brothers, with our fellows, even with our enemies. And I think that this Torah portion has a lot to teach us in every generation. And especially today, I've been thinking quite a bit over the past few weeks about the ways in which we discuss Israel, which is something that's always on my mind. As you know, I lived in Israel for several years. It is a place that I love so, so deeply, and whose value I can't even describe in words. It is a place that I love immensely. And there are lots of discussions right now on all points in the political spectrum about which points of view we will listen to. How much time, energy, and space do we spend justifying and glorifying our own opinions that we are unwilling or unable to learn from our fellow who holds opinions that we find wrong, even repugnant? We've seen this with the American Studies Association and the upcoming debate with the Modern Language Association, that any pro-Israel opinion, I don't even want to call it pro-Israel, any opinion that thinks that boycott, divestment, and sanctions is wrong, any opinion that defends Israel's right to exist and defend itself, should not be allowed on the website, in the conference, should not be given a forum to speak. And on the other hand, we see these articles about Hillel International saying, we are not going to fund or co-sponsor events that promote BDS, boycott, divestment, and sanctions, or events that hold Israel to a double standard or demonize Israel, what have you. In truth, none of you will find this surprising. I don't think that Israel should be boycotted. I don't think that Israel deserves such extreme action. I think that the BDS movement represents a very small and vocal minority that has been denounced by the presidents of over 100 colleges. However, I really feel as though we need to take this Torah portion to heart. How narrow of a space are we willing to relegate ourselves to? To what extent are we going to live in a self-imposed narrow space? I have no influence on the far left, on academic organizations that I am not a part of. I think that they live, even though their mission is to bring light and freedom and intellectual discourse to the world, they are creating an intellectual space that is narrow. And to quote a leader in the Jewish community, what they are doing is anti-Semitic in effect, if not in intent. I think that what they are doing is narrow by not inviting pro-Israel voices into the conversation. The question is, to what extent do we relegate ourselves to a narrow space? We learn in the Talmud that minority opinions are to be preserved, even if they're wrong, even if they're outrageous, even if every other rabbi believes that they have no place in the Jewish tradition. We preserve those minority opinions so that future generations can understand why they were rejected. We not only maintain the minority opinion, but the justification for why it needs to be dismantled and rejected by the mainstream Jewish community. Part of Jewish tradition is maintaining minority opinions and engaging with them, not in order to say that they're okay, not in order to celebrate them or fund them in any meaningful way, but rather to keep the plasticity of the conversation and to understand why that point of view is wrong. And to not reinvent the wheel in every generation and have this conversation over and over again, and for people to think that this opinion is novel and interesting and worth our attention. We maintain it in the corpus, so we understand why it's rejected. So, as a Jewish community in Waterville, or as an American Jewish community, I think it's important that we take some chokhmah, we take some wisdom from Parashat Bo and this plague of darkness. How narrow of a space do we want to live in? What people do we disregard out of hand? And I think what we learn from this parsha is that there's goodness in every human being. There's something to be learned from every human being, even if what we're learning is how deeply wrong the opinions they hold are. Judaism, at its core, is a never-ending, open, dynamic conversation about how we want to live our lives and walk in the world. I think we need to engage with every single point of view. Do we need to fund and co-sponsor every point of view? I don't really think so. However, I think that we can't close off our discussions. We can't shut out people who have opinions different than our own, because then we are preventing ourselves from moving forward, from advancing in the world. And so even though those conversations are difficult, they are uncomfortable, they are upsetting, sometimes they are even deeply repugnant. If we want to advance in the world, we need to engage with every opinion. And I think that's something that we can learn from Parashat Bo. So that is my message for this Shabbat. A few announcements. One is that, courtesy of the Lowensteiner family, we have gotten our new Sidurim, Sidor Lev Shalem, the Sidor of the Complete Heart. And as you can see from the inside, it is in the same fashion as our Machzorim, and I'm very excited to use this Sidor. So services are canceled this week. We will not be having services on the 10th. We will be having services for 2 weeks in January. We will be having services on the 17th and on the 24th. And both of those services will be led by our education director, Melanie Weiss. So we look forward to seeing you for those Shabbat services. We also have a variety of classes offered. I will be teaching Talmud this month. So there are plenty of ways to be engaged with Beth Israel. And if you want to be in contact with us, please feel free to email me to set up a time to have a conversation or coffee. I know that when it is so white outside, you cannot see your fellow. Because there's so much snow and so much cold, we can feel very lonely and alienated. So feel free to email us or to call the synagogue to be in touch with myself or with Mel, to talk, to learn, whatever it may be, to remain in conversation and in prayer. And that's all. Shabbat Shalom.